Welcome everyone to Chevalier's Books Online. We're so excited to have you here tonight for David Leavitt's Shelter in Place. David's novels and story collections include Family Dancing, which is a finalist for the Penn Faulkner Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award, The Lost Language of Cranes, While England Sleeps, and more. He's also the author of 2 nonfiction books, Florence, A Delicate Case, and The Man Who Knew Too Much, Alan Turing and the Invention of the Computer. Currently, he's the co-director of the MFA program in creative writing at the University of Florida, where he is professor of English and also edits the fantastic journal Subtropics.
Thank you.
David, thank you so much for joining us and congratulations. We're thrilled to have you here tonight. And so David is going to give a brief reading and talk about the book, and then we're going to open it up for some audience Q&A. With the Zoom function, you'll have the ability to raise your hand if you're interested in asking a question, and then I can unmute you so you can give David all your thoughts on this fantastic book.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be at Chevalier's virtually. I wish I was there in the flesh. I miss Los Angeles a lot. It's one of my favorite cities. Well, this novel is very much a New York novel. In fact, it takes place pretty much exclusively in New York and its environs, except for a brief section in Venice. And I think what I'm going to do is just read the opening chapter, which is quite short and kind of sets up what's going to happen in the novel. It's a difficult novel to read from because it has a lot of characters and it's mostly dialogue. So this is the opening chapter. Would you be willing to ask Siri how to assassinate Trump? Eva Lindquist asked. It was 4 o'clock on a November afternoon, the first Saturday after the 2016 presidential election, and Eva was sitting on the covered porch of her weekend house in Connecticut with her husband, Bruce, their house guests, Min Marable, Jake Leavitt, and a couple named Aaron and Rachel Weisenstein, both book editors, Grady Cohane, a bachelor choreographer who had a place down the road, and Grady's house guest, his cousin Sandra Bleak, who had recently left her husband and was staying with him while she got herself sorted out. Not sitting on the porch was Eva's younger friend, Matt Pierce, younger in that he was 37. He was in the kitchen preparing a second batch of scones after having had to throw away the first, to which he had forgotten to add baking powder. A benevolent autumn sunset illuminated the scene, which was one of comfort and ease, the porch warm from the wood stove, and the guests snug on the white wicker chairs and sofa, the cushions of which Jake, Eva's decorator, had covered in a chintz called Jubilee Rose. On the white wicker table, a pot of tea, cups, saucers, a bowl of clotted cream, and a bowl of homemade strawberry jam awaited the tardy scones. Eva repeated her question. Who here would be willing to ask Siri how to assassinate Trump? At first, no one answered. I'm only asking because since the election, I've been possessed by this mad urge to ask her, Eva said. Only I'm afraid that if I do, she'll pass it straight on to the Secret Service and they'll arrest me. Darling, I hardly think, Bruce said. Why not, Eva said. I'm sure they can do it. What, listen in on what we say to our phones? Sandra said. I'm not saying they can't do it, Bruce said. I'm just saying that in all probability, the Secret Service has better things to do than monitor our conversations with Siri. Hello, am I the only person here who remembers Watergate? Grady Cohane said. Am I the only person here who remembers phone tapping? Can cell phones be tapped? Rachel Weisenstein asked. I thought only landlines could be tapped. What century are you living in? Aaron asked his wife. I mean, if we were terrorists, maybe, Bruce said, if we were an ISIS cell or something, but a bunch of white people drinking tea on a covered porch in Litchfield County? I don't think so. In that case, do it. Eva handed him her phone. Ask her. But I don't want to assassinate Trump, Bruce said. See, your chicken, Min Marable said, cluck, cluck, cluck. Suddenly, Aaron had one of his famous tantrums. You people, he said, will you just listen to yourselves? I mean, look what's happening to you. Is this really happening? Don't we have a First Amendment in this country? Don't we have the right to say whatever we damn please? Unless it's hate speech, Rachel said. Fuck hate speech, Aaron said. Speaking for myself, I'd be disinclined to take the risk, Min said. What about you, Jake? Me, said Jake, who was not used to being addressed on these occasions. Well, I wouldn't not do it out of fear. I mean, I wouldn't do it, but not out of fear. The thing is, even if you did kill him, would it do any good, Sandra said? Pence would be president. That might actually be worse. We're not talking about actually killing him, Grady said. We're talking about asking Siri how to kill him. There's a big difference. You mean it's a sort of thought experiment, Sandra said. Oh, for God's sake. Aaron took his phone out of his jacket pocket, pressed the home button, and said, Siri, how would I? No, don't. Rachel grabbed the phone away from him. I won't let you. Who, me? Siri said. Give me my phone, Aaron said. That may be beyond my abilities at the moment, Siri said. Only if you promise not to do it, Rachel said. Rachel, I'm asking nicely, Aaron said. Give me back my phone. No. Right then, Matt Pierce came onto the porch with the scones. Sorry for the delay, he said. Normal service has been resumed. What's the matter? I'll count to 10, Aaron said to Rachel. 1, 2, 3. Oh, just take it, Rachel said. Just take the goddamn thing. She threw the phone at him and ran into the house. Everyone looked at Aaron. What? Aaron said. Don't these scones smell delicious? Eva said, but I fear the tea may have oversteeped. I'll make a fresh pot, Matt said, backing through the door that led to the kitchen. And that is how the book begins. I would add that my erstwhile and now retired colleague, Padgett Powell, one thing that of the many things that I learned from him is that he had what he called the Gosling Rule. And the Gosling Rule states that in a work of narrative fiction, the reader imprints on the opening in the same way that Gosling imprints on the first thing it sees. Whatever the first thing it sees, it believes to be its mother. So the first chapter should really be the novel in miniature. And I think this chapter obeys the Gosling Rule.
That's great. Thank you so much for starting us off with that. We are going to go into an audience Q&A, but first I want to ask you some questions. The first one I think it's hard to get around, but this title of your book is so timely. And I'm very curious how it came about.
Well, I didn't think of it. The book's original title, it had many titles, but for the longest time it was called This Was Once the Future, which is a line from a novel by Ivy Compton Burnett. And in fact, I have some dummy jackets with that title. But my editor, Anton Mueller, really felt very strongly, and I agreed with him, that the book was much more about place than it was about time, and that it really needed a title that addressed the idea of time, of place. And the first title that I came up with was The Furniture of Home, which is from the Auden poem that serves as the epigraph, but we didn't think that was very good. And then I guess it was November of 2019, Anton called me up and he said, I think I've thought of a title for your book, Shelter in Place. And I said, oh, that's great. That's terrific. And he said, the only problem is, I don't know if enough people are going to be familiar with the expression, because at that point, that expression really belonged to the past. It belonged to, well, I think Californians know it because of earthquake drills, but it really belonged to the 50s and the Cold War era. So it was purely chance that we titled the book that. Neither of us had any idea at the time of what was coming. So if there was any prescience, it must be attributed to Anton, not to me.
Well, it's certainly, I think it's piquing interest across the board. But it's also, this is a timely book because we are on the cusp of yet another election, which we don't have to go into politics, but the timing is just absolutely impeccable. But speaking of place, I'm curious why, so your characters end up, one of them buys a house in Venice, and I'm curious why you chose that city.
Well, that's a question I could give a very long answer to, but I will give a short answer to. It in the earliest drafts of the novel, it wasn't Venice, it was Paris. That Eva decided where Eva was going to buy an apartment. And I wrote many, many pages about Paris that I have, which I hope I can cannibalize at some point in the future. But as I was thinking about it, I began to realize that Paris was in some ways too fraught and complex a city to really be to offer the kind of escape that Eva seeks. While I was working on the earlier version of the book where she buys the apartment in Paris, there was the Charlie Hebdo incident. There were the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest episodes. There's a lot of political stuff going on in Paris, and I began to think about Venice because Venice has always had this identity, especially among foreigners, as a place that's somehow outside the rest of the world. There are no cars. It's an island. When you're there, you really do feel as if you've stepped off the earth. And so I thought, yeah, Venice is the better place for this, for Eva to decide to escape to.
And thinking about place more generally, this is something that we were talking about earlier, but what is your relationship to home and place in general?
Well, I'm a real homebody in the sense that even before the pandemic, I didn't leave the house that much. Home is very, very important to me. And I have generally lived in places for a fairly long time. The house I live in now, I think we've lived in for 18 years. And periodically we contemplate moving or getting a bigger house or a smaller house here in Gainesville where I live. And then I think to myself, it takes a long time to really feel at home in a place. And when you've invested as much of yourself in a home as I have, I don't know that I want to start again. It would be like a second marriage. That's the, so who knows? I mean, sure, someday possibly, but at the moment, I'm very grateful for my house and I'm very grateful for its familiarity. I think that's especially now really, really important.
Definitely. And does that tie into your writing, do you think? Like, are there certain places you can write and certain places that you can't? Are you very specific about where that is done?
It's interesting that you should ask that. Until the pandemic started, I was a cafe writer. I would go every morning, almost literally every morning at 8 when it opened to a cafe here in Gainesville called Volta. That's where I got the detail about the scones. They make scones there every morning, and one morning the baker forgot to put the baking soda in, or the baking powder. I can't remember which. I'm obviously not a baker. And so when the pandemic started and Volta went into takeout mode, which I'm proud to say they remain in today, even though they could open for customers, the owner is too ethical a human being to do so. It was a bit of a shock to be working at home. I think it had almost become like my office, that place. And but now I've become so used to working at home that if slash when I'm able to write in cafes again, I'm not sure if I will. But certainly when I travel, that's one of my great pleasures, is writing in cafes, or it has been historically.
It'll definitely be interesting to see. I mean, I think a lot of writers during this pandemic have been adjusting to a very different reality. And
Yeah.
it's very curious to hear it's fascinating to hear the different responses.
Well, writing is very solitary to begin with. And I think, I have friends who have to work at home in complete isolation. I think the reason I like working in cafes was that I felt less lonely. I was surrounded by people who I didn't have to talk to well, unless I knew them, who were doing their own thing, and I was doing my own thing, and yet there was a sense of company, which is something that I miss.
Yeah, it's that public solitude.
Yeah, very well put.
Well, thinking of company, was there anyone you were reading during this time? Any books that really influenced the development of this?
Yeah, there were really, I mean, there were a number of writers, but I would say the two major influences were Muriel Spark and Ivy Compton Burnett. Um, Muriel Spark has always been one of my favorite writers, and one thing that I learned from her was I learned a lot about dialogue writing from reading her books, and also something that she's extraordinarily good at is handling large casts of characters. Her novel, The Girls of Slender Means, which I actually just taught to my students last week, um, is about 124 pages long, but it has, I think, about 20 characters, and it moves in and out of multiple points of view. Um, I think she's also a very good satirist, and I learned a lot from her about how to write about people who are rich, not being, of that milieu and myself. The other writer, Ivy Compton Burnett, is a somewhat less well-known writer, but her admirers adore her. She was a British writer who published 19 novels between, I think, 1929 and the late 1960s. They are, I would say, 90% dialogue. They all take place in country houses in kind of generic 19th century England. They're incredibly modernist and experimental. And what I really learned from her was how dialogue could be used to move the action forward, how dialogue could actually be a means of making the narrative move, as opposed to simply something that happens in the narrative. So those were really the writers I was thinking of most intently as I worked on this book.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up comedic turns, because I've seen this book referenced a lot as a comedy of manners. And while it's definitely funny, I'm not sure I would personally categorize it as such, but what would you say to that?
Well, I'll be honest, I didn't think the book was that funny until other people told me it was. I mean, I thought it had some funny parts, but I don't really think of myself as a comic writer in the way that, the sort of writer who makes people just laugh out loud. I think that I don't think I'm humorless, but I don't think of myself as a comic writer. This book, I guess, is funnier than I realized when I was working on it. But comedy of manners doesn't really bother me, nor does drawing room comedy, because I would say another, not really an influence, but a writer I had very much in mind, who I was thinking about a lot while I was working on this, was Noel Coward. And when I think of his plays, which are, definitely comedies of manners, I realized that to some extent I'm kind of riffing on the sort of typical Coward scenario of a bunch of wealthy people getting together and just talking, and various things happening, some of them scandalous, but all through the medium of conversation and with a lot of humor.
Yeah, wow, I feel like I have so many questions and we're already getting audience questions coming in. So I'm going to ask one more and then start taking these cues from the audience, which, by the way, you can drop in the chat or in the Q&A, or you can raise your hand and I will unmute you to ask yourself. But on the topic of communication, you write text messages really well. Not everyone can do it. Sometimes it's a means that we use all the time. So you think people would be able to execute it better, but oftentimes I feel like I'm reading contemporary novels and it just seems like absolutely no one would ever type this out. It doesn't matter who they are. It just seems so forced. So how was that process like for you? Were you pulling from real conversations, or do you just like really inhabit the characters and know their texting styles?
Well, I have to say that I think the writer who has done it most successfully is Sally Rooney in her first novel, Conversations with Friends. I was really, really impressed by how she handled texting, and also simply by how she laid out text conversations. And that was really the first book. And of course, it's a book by a young writer who really grew up with texting, that made me think that I could do it. What I started off with this kind of ridiculous, slightly embarrassing sexting conversation, this sort of exchange of erotic texts, but rather silly ones. But a habit that I have when I'm texting is that I often send text to the wrong people. Usually I will inadvertently send to whoever is at the top of the list. Well, that hasn't gotten me any trouble so far, although it's confused a lot of my friends, because I've sent them texts that make no sense to them. But I started thinking about that, and that was when I decided to bring the character of Min into that conversation, and have Jake having sort of two text conversations simultaneously and intermittently sending the wrong text to the wrong person. And I think that was the element that really brought that scene alive for me, was that idea of, and I think it's something we all do now, that it's a kind of multitasking. I'm not going to talk about Jeffrey Toobin, I promise, but that does seem to be where this inevitably leads. But let's not go there.
Yeah, I was thinking this is like the 2020 version of the purloined letter. Wayward messages.
Oh yeah, and as I said, I do it all the time, but I guess it's just a matter of time before I send the fatal message.
Well, hopefully we can avoid that. But would love to turn to the audience now. We have two questions already coming in. The first one is, obviously, we have a debate tomorrow night, but so the context of this is that everyone knows where they were, the night, November 2016. Do you remember where you were that night and what were you doing?
Oh yes, I remember it. I will never forget it. I was here. I was at home. My husband and I started watching the returns. We got increasingly nervous as the night went on, and things did not go the way we expected. My very dear friend Jill Cement, who is an LA native, but who now lives here in Gainesville, her husband had died just a few weeks before, and she was at her house with another friend of ours, Amy Hempel, also a writer, and we were texting as we watched the returns. And at a certain point, I just thought, I can't watch these anymore. And I took a sleeping pill, which is something I almost never do, and I went to bed. And I woke up at about 4 a.m. with this just feeling of incredible dread and anxiety, and went downstairs to see what had happened. And I saw what had happened. And I guess ever since then, I've been trying to deal with it, as we all have. Writing this book was a help. It was sort of therapeutic for me, and Eva as a character was an opportunity for me to vent some of my own rage through her. I also think that Eva is rather prescient, because she thinks things are going to be much worse than her friends do, and lo and behold, she was right. They are.
Yeah, it's interesting how that sixth sense is usually correct. But speaking about characters, we have another question that's coming in about an attendee who is halfway through Shelter in Place, and feeling like these characters are very purposely unlikable. So can you speak a bit about your intention with writing them and how you found their voices and personalities?
Well, it's funny. I kind of like them, but they're all like my children. One loves one's children. I mean, again, going back to Muriel Spark. Muriel Spark has often been described as a cruel writer, and many of the characters in her books are not only unlikable, they're actually quite evil. Um, and I frankly find unlikable people really pretty interesting. But I did try to balance the novel by having some characters who I think are generally more sympathetic. One being Eva's husband, Bruce, another being his secretary, Kathy, whom Bruce wants to help, and also Jake, who is probably the character who most closely resembles me, even as a last name that's rather similar to mine. Um, Matt, Pierce, these are all decent people. They're a bit overshadowed by the sort of very high octane personalities of Eva and Min and Rachel and Aaron. But honestly, I had so much fun with those characters, and even if I found them dislikable, I found them dislikable in a kind of funny and interesting way. I also, it's funny. I'm considering possibly writing another book about Eva in Venice, and I think one of the reasons I want to do it is because I'm actually have a lot of compassion and sympathy for her, and maybe it will take another book to show that side of her.
Well, I guess we'll find out.
Yeah.
Maybe after this next election.
Yeah. Until January 22nd, I don't know what I'm doing.
All right, we've got some hand raised. So JG, I'm going to allow you to unmute if you would like to ask a question. And also Natalie has raised her hand.
Oh, hi,
so
Natalie.
I'm going to give you a chance if you'd like to chat.
I just want to say Natalie was a student of mine as an undergraduate. She's now a professor at Cal State Fullerton and the author of an absolutely wonderful book of poems that came out in 2017, won the Cave Canem Prize. And it's great to see you, Natalie.
Oh, thank you. You too. This is so excited with writing notes. I'm like, oh man, I can't get back into a class, but this is close. I had a question about the idea of like politics and pain and trauma, and I was curious about just maybe some of your thoughts about how to keep politics from like taking over the novel or pulling it away from your characters. Like, how are you able to start in this place that's so charged that people already bring so much to, and then your first chapter is it's so much, it's so rich and about the characters and so in the life of the characters, and it doesn't pull, like the politics don't pull away from the moment. So I'm curious about like how you're able to hold those both aloft and like keep, one from like taking over, because sometimes the politics bring along with it like pain and trauma that are so big that it just seems like hard to carry alongside a novel.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I understand because I think that I'm feeling that in my own life, as so many of us are. I think the way I managed to avoid that, if I did, which I think I did, is by really by through story. The characters interact and do things that they would not necessarily have done if the election had gone differently. Eva suddenly decides to buy this apartment in Venice. That opens up a rift between her and her husband. Her husband's secretary has been diagnosed with lymphoma, and her husband has left her. Bruce decides to help her. Would he have made that move if his world hadn't been turned upside down? There's also I decided I needed to include in the book a Trump supporter, and so one of the minor characters or less important characters is Bruce and Eva's next door neighbor, with whom Alec, with whom Bruce often walks his dogs, and in portraying him and trying to make him into a sympathetic human being, which I felt was important, I had to give him a story. And so the story has to do with how his daughter, who is an ardent Democrat and was a supporter of Hillary, has stopped speaking to him and has told him that she will not allow him to see her children unless he renounces his political position. And so that was a way of humanizing his story as well. And so I suppose in a broad sense, the solution was just storytelling, using this political crisis as a starting point, but then just employing all the things that I would employ in other novels that were less centered on politics.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Natalie. It's so great to see you.
Thanks, Natalie. JG, you still have your hand raised. Would you like to ask a question, or would anyone else like to raise a hand or drop a line in the Q&A? If not, I do have another question of my own, which is a very LA question that is it's kind of our duty to ask, but because Shelter in Place is actually pretty cinematic, do you have roles in mind for who would play your characters if this were adapted into a movie?
It's funny, other people have asked me that, and the answer is I usually do for my books, but I don't actually in this case. And I'm not sure why that is, why I haven't gone down that road, which I certainly did with the 2 Hotel Frankfurts. I had the whole thing cast as I was writing it. It may be because, you know, as a result of the fact that I don't see a lot of contemporary movies or watch a lot of contemporary television, I've sort of lost touch with how old actors are. Like, I don't know, like, who are the actors who would be the right age to play Eva and Bruce. The actors who I think of as being in their mid 50s are all now actually like in their 70s. So that may be part of the reason. But yeah, I mean, I certainly see the book as somewhat cinematic or possibly even theatrical, because, you know, there is so much dialogue. And again, that's what I love theater, and that's what great playwrights do, is they propel the story forward through dialogue.
So we've got another question from a fellow writer who is in the midst of writing his own novel. And he's wondering, how long did it take you to write this book? Did you ever reach a point where you might have given it up?
Oh, about 700 times. It took, well, okay, so my last book was published in 2013, and then I started and gave up on about 5 different books that 2 nonfiction books and 3 novels that just didn't go anywhere. I've saved them all in case I can do something with them in the future. And then this book, I would say I started in earnest in 2016, right after the election. Although at that point it was actually set in 2000 after the Bush v. Gore debacle, and I moved it to the present once I realized that that was what I was having. All my emotions were focused on Trump, not there was no good reason to set it in the past. But I started it for a long time. It was in first person from the point of view of Jake. It went through, you know, many incarnations. There was a lot of material that I cut. I probably cut as much. There's about as much that isn't in the book as there is. As many pages were cut from it over time. Several times I was ready for a divorce. I was ready to give it up. I think that is inevitable, and those are hard periods to go through. And the only advice I could give is when you reach a point, Rachel Cusk writes about this in her memoir Aftermath. When you reach a point where it feels as if the novel, I'm semi-quoting her here, won't be written or won't allow you to go further with it, the problem is usually that you've gone astray from the truth, that you've allowed, say, plot or extra literary concerns to um, to lead you away from where you ought to be. And at those moments, the best thing you can do is just put it aside for a while, take a break, then return to it with a little bit of distance. And I also think another really helpful exercise, which I did many times, is if you're writing in first person and it's not working, try it in third person. If you're writing in third person and it's not working, try it in first person. You'll probably end up back with whichever perspective you began with, but sometimes that shift allows you to get a fresh perspective. But it's inevitable. I don't know any writer except perhaps Muriel Spark who has ever written a book just from start to finish without a few episodes of I'm done with this. It's over. I'm not writing anymore.
I always think I've seen Rachel Cusk speak a couple of times, and when she talks about writing and overwriting, she always references D.H. Lawrence, who she says writes 100 pages more than you think you should, because you never know when you're going to get there. But we have another question coming in about this editing process, about what factors you consider when you're cutting sections. And was there a section that you cut that you kind of wish you'd left in now?
Well, so I all through I was cutting for balance. A lot of it, especially when you have a novel like this, which has a lot of characters and a lot of different stories that are going on simultaneously, you have to make sure that you're balanced. You need to make sure that you don't go for too long without losing track of a certain character or a certain story. So there was sort of cutting constantly. And then when the book was finished, I cut an entire chapter that had to do with Jake's childhood and how he became a decorator. He had an aunt who was a famous decorator who took him under her wing, and that I was sad to cut, but it totally threw off the balance of the novel. The only other thing that I cut, which I sort of regret, is there was a little coda at the very end, just a little 1 or 2 paragraph section that I cut because I decided it was extraneous. And then I was talking the other day to my agent, and she said, "Oh, I love that last scene when they're looking at the plane in the sky." And I said, "Jen, I cut that scene like a year ago." She said, "Oh, why did you cut it?" And I thought, "Oh no, what have I done?" But I think the ending is fine as it is. I actually don't think it needed that scene, but I do miss it.
It's hard. It's so satisfying when you feel like it's complete, but then there's always this unlived life hanging out there.
Yeah, and there's, I mean, I know writers, Rachel Cusk is one of them, who write very quickly. Well, what she says is that she thinks about her books for maybe 2 years, and then she writes them in 5 weeks. And she really does. It's kind of an extraordinary thing. I envy those writers who, because by the time a writer like Rachel sits down to write, she knows exactly what she's going to do, and she has absolute conviction. I am more the kind of writer who flounders until I eventually find my way, which gets fatiguing. And that's why I envy Rachel, and I also envy Muriel Spark, who wrote the Prime of Miss Jean Brodie in 3 weeks.
That's wild. It's such a masterpiece.
It's such an incredible book, and she really did write it in 3 weeks. It's been established. It wasn't just a story she told. Also, another former student of mine, Kevin Wilson, his most recent book, Nothing to See Here, I think he wrote in something like 2 weeks.
Wow.
I know.
I can't even focus on anything for 2 weeks, I don't think, at this point. Not in this pandemic.
No, not at this point.
We've got another question coming in from someone who was very attached to Ava and found themselves rooting for her so hard. There's a lot of scrutiny that happens with men who write female characters because they're often disappointing. So do you have any advice for how men can be better at writing female characters, or any input on why it's so easy to go wrong?
Well, I mean, I think when I think of men who I mean, this gets really interesting when you have a question of a male writer with a writing from a female point of view, from with a woman narrator, and the most kind of extraordinary example I can think of that phenomenon is Norman Rush's novel Mating, which I think is an amazing novel with a very persuasive female narrator. It's funny that women, I think, are able to write from male perspectives quite a bit more easily than men are from women's perspectives. I don't know. I mean, I've always written a lot about women, and I'm, frankly, find women generally much more interesting than men. uh, uh, and so perhaps this novel simply reflects uh, a certain tendency I have toward kind of to developing these sort of I don't know what to call them, kind of intellectual or sentimental crushes on women. Eva, I am very infatuated with, much as her friends are, and I know for a lot of people she's pretty intolerable, but I think that she's got a lot of depth to her. There are aspects of her that are very irritating and obnoxious, but there are other aspects of her that are that suggest that she's a woman of vision, of and very, very brilliant, even though she hasn't really done very much with her amazing mind. Uh, so yeah, I mean, I don't think I could have written this book if I hadn't felt a lot of love for Eva.
Do you generally feel like you're like loving and compassionate towards your characters?
Yeah, I feel it. I am. My first teacher, the infamous Gordon Lish, once said that the greatest sin a writer can commit is to put themselves in a position of moral superiority to their characters. I've kind of hewed to that rule because that's the only way I can write. But then again, I look at someone like Muriel Spark, who again I just have such admiration for, and she always puts herself in a position of moral superiority to her characters, and often seems to write much more out of a disdain or even hatred for them than out of a love for them. And yet she gets away with it because I think that behind that cruelty, it's all about truth. She's getting at the truth. And if the truth is ugly, she's not going to try to prettify it. But often, even her least likable characters, they always feel real. And I think that is probably the thing that's most important to me. If the character's human, I will end up caring about that character, even if this is someone who, in my own life, I would want to steer clear of.
Yeah, I think that reminds me a lot of Ottessa Moshfegh's writing, and really kind of unlikable characters. She comes across very morally superior, but it's like you said, they have to feel real, otherwise they'll just be truly unlikable.
Yeah, and that's I think part of Muriel Spark's genius. But I can't really, I cannot put myself in quite the same position of writing as a kind of god that she does. I think I don't have that much self-confidence. The remarkable thing about Muriel Spark was that she started writing relatively late. She was in her late 30s when she published her first novel, but from the get-go, she was absolutely sure of herself. She was sure that she was a genius, and she never lost that conviction, even during periods when she herself was the subject of a lot of very negative publicity, and even when her books got kind of panned, she had this astonishing faith in herself that bordered on arrogance, but is borne out by the incredible quality of her work. I love talking about other writers much more
Well, speaking of your writing, have you been writing during this pandemic? And I'm guessing the answer. I'll let you finish.
It's been hard. It's been hard. I've produced a lot of fragments of things that haven't really gone anywhere. Uh, I think it's going to be very difficult to write about the pandemic until, well, I'm not going to say until it's over, but until we have a clearer sense of where the story is going. Um, uh, so it, I kind of, as I said, I'm sort of working on two books. One is a sequel of sorts to Shelter in Place, and the other is a hypothetical nonfiction book. Again, everything's hypothetical at this point, which is about my own. Uh, it's about another writer, George W.S. Trow, who was an essayist and nonfiction writer for the New Yorker, who died in 2006, and whose work I only discovered after he died. And he died rather mysteriously in Naples, Italy. And I'm kind of interested in finding out more about his death. And if it weren't for the pandemic, I would have gone this summer to Naples to try to do some research, but that will have to wait. But in the meantime, George Trow is very much on my mind, and someone I would recommend fervently. Particularly his most famous book, which is called "Within the Context of No Context," a long essay really about television that was published. It took up almost an entire issue of the New Yorker when it was published in 1980. It tells you a lot about what the New Yorker was like then, that such an oddball, eccentric work would be almost an entire issue would be given over to it.
As a follow-up to that question about, well, just thinking about fragmentary writing, do you find that, so like you're working on these two separate projects, but is your writing actually like in craft? Shorter sentences? Are you finding it's like shorter narrative lines? Are you leaning towards short stories more than actual like long form?
No, I'm still thinking long form, but I'm having trouble getting going, which is why I have a lot of beginnings that I've written. Um, but I'm sort of determined now that this book has been published to I really need to sit down and commit myself to something. As I said, I admire tremendously writers with conviction, which is why one of the many reasons why Rachel Cusk, whose name has come up a lot, is probably the contemporary writer I most admire. There's such assurance, such conviction, such uh, uh, commitment to an idea of truth, and I feel like I could learn some things from her if I could. I need to sort of have a little kind of internalize some of her conviction, especially right now. So what's helpful? Reading is helpful. Rereading is helpful. Rereading my favorite books that I love is probably the thing I've done that is will get me going again. I hope.
We can only hope at this point.
Yes.
As our hour is winding down, I do want to do one last call for audience questions, which you're welcome to again drop in the Q&A. Until then, what is one thing that you hope readers take away from your book?
Well, I think when I decided to write about Trump's election, I realized that I had to write about it comedically, and I would distinguish the word comedic from comic. I didn't ever intend this book to be kind of a satire or anything that broad, but I did intend it for it to be comedic as opposed to tragic. It seemed to me a lot of the writing that I was reading about the post-Trump world, especially in the early years, was so depressing, and that made sense. It was depressing. It was awful. It was often traumatic. But I've always found that the best way to get as a writer to approach the traumatic and the terrible is through comedy. Ironically, what you don't want to do is effectively show the reader a brick wall and then shove them into it. And there is comedy in this story, and comedy was the way I was able to write about it. But I think it's more than a comedy. I mean, I think it's actually a pretty serious consideration of a lot of questions about sort of principally about the ideas of safety and freedom, and whether any of us can ever really attain either one, and if they're mutually exclusive. But comedy was the way into it, and I suppose that's what I hope people take away is that I didn't mean this novel to be simply a kind of satire. I meant it to be a comedic take on some very serious questions.
Definitely questions we should be asking right now. So as our hour is closing down, I want to thank you so much for joining us, David.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Such a pleasure. If you're interested in getting a copy of Shelter in Place, please drop us a line at chevaliersbooks@gmail.com. We would love to put one into your hands from 6 feet away. And again, thank you so much for joining us, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you. You too. Thank you to everyone, and kisses to my friends and my stepmother and my former student Natalie and everyone who's out there who I know.
All right. Ciao, everyone.
Good night.